The candles were too bright. That was the first thing Ivy noticed when she stepped into the grand hall of Thornfield Castle. Not the silk banners draped from the vaulted ceiling, not the perfume of jasmine and beeswax that thickened the air until breathing felt like swallowing something sweet and suffocating, not the hundreds of noble eyes that turned toward her like wolves scenting prey. Just the candles. Dozens of iron chandeliers, each one blazing with flame so sharp it made her temples ache. She had been sleeping poorly for weeks. Everything hurt more than it should. She pressed her gloved fingers together beneath the fold of her skirt and kept walking. "You look like your mother tonight," Lord Harwick had said before she left the estate, his voice carrying that particular softness men used when they wanted something. "Your mother, just before she married your father, beautiful and obedient." Ivy had smiled the way she had been trained to smile. She had said nothing. She was 23 years old, and she had learned very early that silence was the only armor available to her. The grand ball of the Ascension was held once every 5 years in the kingdom of Velmore, and every unmated female of noble blood was expected to attend. That was the formal language. The real language was simpler. The Alpha King would be present, and any woman not in attendance would be considered an insult to the crown. So they came. They always came. They wore their finest gowns and their brightest jewels, and they stood in careful lines and waited to be seen. Ivy wore deep green. Not because it was fashionable. Ivory was fashionable this season. Every other woman in the hall shimmered like moonstone. But because green had been her mother's color, and wearing it was the closest thing to defiance she could manage without consequences. Her mother had died when Ivy was 9. She barely remembered her face now, only impressions. The smell of lavender, the weight of a hand on her hair, a voice low and steady as a river. What remained most clearly was the absence, the specific shape of something taken. What had followed the absence was Lord Harwick, her father's oldest friend, her guardian, appointed by the council when her father followed her mother into the ground 4 years later. A man with kind eyes and careful manners and a habit of appearing at her door late in the evening to discuss estate matters that always seemed to require her signature. Ivy had been signing things for years. She had stopped questioning what she signed. That, she understood now, had been a terrible mistake. She found her assigned position near the third pillar on the eastern wall, beside a girl named Rosalind, whose hands were shaking so badly that her earrings trembled. Ivy stood straight and breathed slowly, and did not allow herself to look toward the dais at the far end of the hall, where the throne sat empty and waiting. "They say he hasn't chosen anyone in 3 balls," Rosalind whispered. "Then he won't choose tonight either," Ivy said. "My mother says he's looking for something specific." "Your mother says a great many things." Rosalind blinked, uncertain whether that was an insult. And then the horns sounded. The sound came from somewhere above them, long and resonant, and deep enough to press against the ribs. Every voice in the hall stopped. Every candle seemed to lean in a single direction. Then the great doors at the northern end opened, and Adrian, Alpha King of Velmore, walked into the room. Ivy had expected ceremony. What she had not expected was stillness. He moved without performance. That was the only way she could describe it. He was tall, taller than the guards flanking him, and the guards were not small men. And he wore black with a single silver clasp at his throat, no crown, no excessive ornamentation. His dark hair was cut short. His jaw was sharp. His eyes, even at this distance, even through 50 feet of candlelit space, were amber gold and completely calm. He surveyed the room, the way a man surveys territory he has already decided belongs to him, without hunger, without hurry, simply knowing. The women around Ivy straightened. Some smiled. Some held their breath. Ivy watched him and felt nothing except a distant, careful wariness. The same feeling she had learned to keep in reserve whenever powerful men entered rooms. The evening proceeded in its expected order. Music, formality, presentation. The king moved through the hall with 2 advisors at his flanks, acknowledging noble families by name accepting bows, exchanging brief words. He did not smile often. When he did, it was small and deliberate, not decorative. Ivy spent the first hour studying the exits. There were 4. The main doors, a servant's passage behind the eastern tapestry, a corridor leading toward the kitchens that she had mapped on her way in, and the tall windows on the southern wall that opened, she suspected, onto a garden below. She had made a habit of identifying exits. It had begun as anxiety and had become something closer to instinct. The reason lived in a letter she was not supposed to know about. 3 weeks ago, she had gone to Lord Harwick's study to return a ledger. She had been reviewing the estate accounts, as she did every quarter, finding small comfort in numbers that at least behaved predictably. And she had found the study empty but unlocked. She should have left the ledger and gone. Instead, something had kept her there. A smell, maybe. Something sharp and unfamiliar beneath the usual cedar and ink. She had set the ledger down, and her eyes had moved, without intention, to the paper that lay open on the desk. She had read only 4 lines before she understood that her life had been constructed on a floor with nothing underneath it. The letter was addressed to a man named Corvin, a merchant lord from the northern reaches, someone she had never met, someone whose name she had heard only in passing. The letter, in Lord Harwick's handwriting, confirmed the completion of the first transfer of assets from the Whitmore estate, described the second transfer as contingent upon the girl's continued ignorance, and ended with a date, the date of the Ascension Ball, followed by the words, "by which point the matter will be permanently resolved." Permanently resolved. Ivy had stood in that study for a long time, the ledger still in her hands, her reflection thin and still in the dark window glass. Then she had replaced the letter exactly as she had found it, left the ledger on the edge of the desk, and walked to her room with perfect composure. She had not slept well since. She did not know precisely what permanently resolved meant. She suspected it was not kind. Her parents' estate, Whitmore, a modest holding of woodland and farmland in the valley below the castle ridge, had been in her family for 4 generations. She had believed it was still hers. She had believed a great many things that were no longer true. The music shifted. A slower piece now, stately and low. Ivy became aware that the crowd near her had thinned. She glanced up from the floor, she had been staring at the floor, and realized that the presentations were concluding, the formality loosening into the softer second movement of the evening, conversation, wine, the subtle performances of people hoping to be noticed. She did not want to be noticed. She wanted to think. She had come tonight because refusing the royal summons was impossible, but she had intended to remain at the edge of things, unobserved and quiet, until she could leave. What she had not intended was to find herself suddenly, inexplicably alone in a slight gap in the crowd, the noise of the hall flowing around her like water around a stone. And in that gap, close enough that she could have reached out and touched the silver clasp at his throat, stood the Alpha King. He was not looking at her, the way men usually looked at her. That particular sliding assessment, that inventory. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a person they have been waiting to find. It lasted only a moment. Then he turned slightly toward her, inclining his head in the small formality of acknowledgement, and said very quietly, in a voice meant only for her, "Did you ever get my letter?" The hall continued around them. Music, laughter, the clink of goblets. No one was listening. No one was near enough to hear. Ivy felt the cold move through her, slow and absolute, like water rising in a sealed room. She looked at him directly. Amber eyes, calm face, not a trace of cruelty, not a trace of performance. And she thought of the letter on Lord Harwick's desk. The assets transferred. The date circled. The words permanently resolved. She thought of exits. She counted them again, quietly behind her eyes. Then she said, with a composure that surprised even herself, "I receive a great deal of correspondence, Your Majesty. You will need to be more specific." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. Something more careful than that. His gaze moved over her face. Not her gown, not her jewels, her face. And he said nothing for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then, very quietly, "I think you haven't received it at all." And that was when Ivy understood that the evening she had planned, invisible, careful, uneventful, was already over. She did not sleep that night. Back at Harwick's estate, in the narrow room that had been hers since childhood, the same window overlooking the same gray courtyard, the same crack running along the ceiling plaster like a river on a map, Ivy lay fully dressed on top of the coverlet and stared upward and thought about the Alpha King's voice. "I think you haven't received it at all." He had said it without accusation, without drama, the way a man states something he has already confirmed quietly to himself, long before the conversation began. Then his advisor had appeared at his shoulder, a lean beta with silver-streaked hair and the efficient manner of someone who manages large things without appearing to do so. And the king had inclined his head toward her in that small, formal way and moved on, absorbed back into the ceremony as though the exchange had never happened. But it had happened. Ivy pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose and thought carefully. A letter from the Alpha King, addressed to her, presumably, since he had asked her specifically. A letter she had never received, which meant it had been intercepted, opened, read, and kept by someone in this house. The most likely candidate required no great investigation. Lord Harwick controlled everything that entered and left this estate. Correspondence, provisions, visitors, and for the past 14 years, Ivy herself. She sat up slowly. The candle on her nightstand had burned to a stub. Outside, the courtyard was dark and quiet. Only the distant sound of the stable boys settling the horses for the night, the low movement of wind through the oak at the far wall. She looked at her own hands in the dim light. Ink stained at the right forefinger, as always. Thin. She had not been eating well. The anxiety had a way of sitting in her throat and making food feel like a negotiation. She needed to find that letter. The thought arrived not with excitement, but with the specific cold clarity of necessity. She did not know what the king had written. She did not know why he had written to her at all. A minor noble, an orphaned ward, a girl whom the court would not notice missing. But the fact that Harwick had kept the letter meant it contained something Harwick did not want her to have. And given what she had read on that desk 3 weeks ago, the transfers, the merchant lord, the date, the words permanently resolved, she could not afford to leave any piece of information uncollected. She stood, picked up the candle stub, and moved to the door. The house was asleep. That was the advantage of being considered unremarkable. No one thought to watch her closely. The servants assumed she was obedient. Harwick assumed she was ignorant. She had spent years allowing both assumptions to stand, never fully understanding, until recently, that she was quietly building something inside that ignorance. A patience, a precision, an eye for detail that had nowhere useful to go. Now it had somewhere to go. She moved through the corridor in silence, her slippered feet making no sound on the stone floor. Past the tapestry of the founding hunt, past the door to the upper solar, down the back stairwell that smelled of cold ash and old wool. The study was on the ground floor, east wing, beside the room where Harwick kept the estate ledgers she had been reviewing for years, dutifully, never asking why certain columns never quite balanced. She had a reason now to understand the imbalance. The study door was locked tonight. It had not been locked that first time. He had been careless, or confident, or both. She stood before it for a moment, listening. Then she thought of the spare key. Every room in this house had a spare key, kept on a ring in the housekeeper's cabinet, because the old lord, Ivy's father, had believed in practical redundancy. Harwick had never changed that system. He had never imagined Ivy would use it. She retrieved the ring. She returned. She opened the door. The study smelled of cedar, tallow, and something beneath both. Something metallic and faintly medicinal that she had noticed before and dismissed as the remnants of whatever Harwick kept in the locked cabinet near the window. She noticed it more sharply now. Her instincts, long muffled by years of careful smallness, were beginning to surface. She went to the desk first. The letter she had seen 3 weeks ago was gone. She had expected that. But the desk had 3 drawers, and she had only ever seen the surface. She opened the first, correspondence, mostly sealed and unread, addressed to Harwick from various merchants and council members. The second, blank paper, a wax seal stamp, a worn quill. The third, locked. She looked at the keyring. There were 43 keys. She tried 6 before one turned. Inside the drawer was a bundle of documents tied with brown cord. She carried them to the window where the moonlight was strongest and untied the cord with careful fingers. The first document was the original deed to the Whitmore estate. Her name was not on it. She read that again. Slowly. Her name was not on it. The deed, dated 11 years ago, she would have been 12, listed Lord Harwick as sole trustee and acting owner, pending transfer upon the ward's lawful union or confirmed incapacity. The language was bureaucratic and calm and utterly devastating. She had believed the estate was held in her name. She had believed she would inherit it fully at 25. She had been wrong about both things, and the wrongness had been written down and sealed and filed while she was still a child who cried for her dead mother. She set the deed aside. Her hands were steady. She was distantly amazed by that. The second document was a contract between Harwick and the merchant Lord Corvin. It outlined the phased sale of Whitmore's timber rights, farmland, and mill access over a period of 3 years, the final transfer to be completed by the first month after the Ascension Ball. In exchange, Corvin would provide Harwick with a sum large enough to settle what appeared to be a considerable private debt. Ivy stared at the number. Then she turned the page. The third document was smaller. A single folded sheet, sealed with black wax that had already been broken. She opened it. It was not from Harwick. The handwriting was different, precise, economical. The hand of someone accustomed to writing orders rather than requests. The seal, she realized when she turned the broken wax over, bore the royal crest of Velmore, a wolf ascending, wings spread, crown above. To Ivy Whitmore, of Whitmore Vale, it began. It has come to my attention through council records that your estate has been subject to unauthorized transactions since the 4th year of your guardianship. The irregularities suggest deliberate mismanagement at the least, and criminal fraud at the most. As Alpha King of Velmore, I am writing to inform you that I am opening a formal inquiry and that you have the right to present testimony before the Crown Council. A representative will be sent to your estate within the fortnight following this letter. Please confirm receipt. Adrian, Alpha King of Velmore. Below the formal signature, in slightly smaller script, as though added after, I am told you review the estate accounts yourself. If you have noticed discrepancies, save everything you find. You will need it. Ivy read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of the study, her back against the cold desk, the letter in her lap. And she allowed herself exactly 1 minute of something that was not quite crying, and not quite breathing, and not quite anything she had a name for. Her chest pressed inward. Her eyes burned. The stone floor was cold through her dress, and she did not move because she did not trust her legs yet. He had known. The king had known. And he had written to her, and Harwick had intercepted the letter, and hidden it in a locked drawer, and continued selling her land piece by piece, while she sat at supper across from him, and passed the bread, and answered his questions about her health. The minute ended. She folded the letter with precise care, and placed it inside her dress, against her ribs. Then she returned the remaining documents to the drawer, relocked it, and replaced the key ring in the housekeeper's cabinet. She moved through the house with the same silence as before, back up the stairs, back down the corridor, back into her room. She closed the door softly. She did not light a new candle. She stood at the window for a long time, looking at the courtyard below. The oak tree moved in the wind. The stable was dark. The road leading away from the estate was a pale thread in the moonlight, running north, toward the castle, toward the capital, toward a man who had tried to warn her and whose warning had been stolen. She thought about the ball. The way he had looked at her. Not like an object. Not like a social obligation. Like someone he had been searching for in a crowd, and had finally, after some difficulty, located. "I think you haven't received it at all." No. She hadn't. But she had it now. The question was what to do before Harwick realized the drawer had been opened. The question was how much time she had before that date on the contract arrived, and the matter was permanently resolved. The question was whether she could reach the king again. Officially, safely. With proof. Before whoever Harwick had hired to resolve her had the opportunity to do so. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. She had the letter. She had the contract. She had 14 years of account reviews in her own handwriting, stored in a box beneath her bed. Because she had always been meticulous, even when she had not understood why. She was not without resources. She had simply not known until now that they were weapons. She began, quietly, in the dark, to plan. She left before dawn. Not in panic. Not in the stumbling, breathless way of someone who has finally broken. She left the way she had done everything for the past 14 years. Quietly, precisely, without giving the house any reason to notice her until she was already gone. She took 3 things. The letter from the king, folded against her ribs, her box of account records, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked under her arm, and the small pouch of coins she had been setting aside for 2 years from the household allowance Harwick gave her for personal expenses. Never enough to seem significant, always enough, if accumulated carefully, to matter. She left a candle burning in her room. She made her bed. She placed her nightgown across the pillow in the approximate shape of a sleeping figure, which would not fool anyone for long but might buy her until mid-morning. Then she went out through the kitchen passage, past the sleeping scullery girl, through the garden gate that she had oiled herself 3 weeks ago after noticing it had begun to squeak. She had oiled it without knowing why. She understood now that some part of her had been preparing for this longer than her conscious mind had admitted. The road north was empty in the gray pre-dawn. Cold, rutted from recent rain, edged on both sides by forest that pressed close and smelled of pine resin and wet earth. She walked quickly, her boots sinking slightly with each step, her breath making small clouds in the dark air. The oilcloth bundle was heavier than she had expected. She shifted it to her other arm and kept moving. She had perhaps 6 hours before Harwick discovered her absence. Possibly less, if any of the servants woke early and noticed the kitchen passage door unlatched. The capital was a full day's ride by horse, which meant on foot, carrying a bundle, with no fresh horse and no escort. She was not going to arrive in time to do anything useful before he sent someone after her. She needed another option. The village of Crestholme sat 3 miles north on the same road. A small market settlement with a smithy, a mill, a tavern that doubled as a boarding house, and, more importantly, a posting station where crown messengers changed horses on their routes between the capital and the eastern territories. She had passed through it dozens of times in Harwick's carriage, always veiled, always supervised, always invisible in the way that wards of minor nobles are expected to be invisible. Today she was going to be visible. She reached Crestholme as the sky turned from black to pale gray, the first wood smoke rising from cottage chimneys, a dog barking somewhere near the mill. The posting station was already active. A crown messenger in the distinctive dark blue cloak was watering his horse at the trough while the stable hand prepared a fresh mount. Ivy stopped at the edge of the yard and assessed. The messenger was young. That was useful. Young riders, in her experience, were more likely to respond to directness than to rank, because they had not yet learned the particular caution that came with years of court proximity. She walked across the yard. "I need to send word to the castle," she said. "Directly to the Alpha King's personal counsel, not through the standard post." The messenger looked up from his horse with the expression of someone who hears impossible requests regularly and has developed a practiced patience about it. "The royal post doesn't carry private correspondence to the king's council, my lady. You'd need to petition through the—" "My name is Ivy Whitmore," she said. "Of Whitmore Vale. The king opened a formal inquiry into my estate. He sent me a letter. which was intercepted by my guardian before I could receive it. I have the letter now, and I have 14 years of fraudulent account records to support what it describes. I need to reach someone in the council who is expecting to hear from me." She said it steadily, without embellishment. She had rehearsed it during the walk, trimming it down to only what was factual and only what would matter to someone who had 2 minutes and a fresh horse and a schedule to keep. The messenger went still. He looked at her more carefully now, at the oilcloth bundle, at the mud on her boots, at the dark circles under her eyes that 14 years of tension and 3 weeks of near sleeplessness had pressed into her face. He was weighing something. She could see it happening. "The inquiry assigned to Whitmore Vale," he said slowly, "was handled by Commander Aldrich of the King's Council. I carried documents from that inquiry myself 2 months ago." "Then you know it exists," Ivy said. A pause. Then he reached into the leather satchel at his hip and produced a small piece of parchment and a traveling ink stick, the compressed kind that Crown messengers carried for field documentation. He held it out. "Write the name and nature of your request," he said. "I'll deliver it to Commander Aldrich personally when I reach the capital. I stop there before the Eastern Post. 4 hours." Ivy wrote quickly. Name, estate, nature of the fraudulent documentation, confirmation that she held the king's original letter. She handed it back. He folded it and pressed his own seal, small, blue, the Crown messenger's mark, onto the fold. "Where will you be?" he asked. She had not thought that far. She thought now, quickly. "The tavern here," she said. "However long my coins last." He nodded once, mounted the fresh horse, and was gone down the road before the stable hand had finished latching the yard gate. Ivy stood in the posting yard for a moment, the oilcloth bundle in her arms, the cold morning air settling around her. Then she went to find the tavern. It was called the Iron Hearth, and it smelled exactly as its name suggested. Iron and fire, and the accumulated warmth of years of cooking and wet wool and spilled ale. The innkeeper was a broad woman named Marta, who asked no unnecessary questions and charged a fair price for a bowl of porridge, a corner seat by the fire, and the understanding that Ivy would be left alone. Ivy ate slowly and thought about what came next. She could not go back to Harwick's estate. That was finished. Everything she had signed over the years, and she had signed a great deal, always trusting, always careful not to make trouble, would need to be reviewed by the council. Some of it might be reversible. Some of it certainly was not. The timber rights and farmland sales to Corvin were the largest losses, but the estate itself, the original deed, the land title, those might still be contested if the fraud could be proven. She had the proof in the oilcloth bundle. 14 years of accounts in her own hand. Every discrepancy marked in the margins in small, precise notes, because she had always known something was wrong with the numbers, even when she had not understood what it meant. She spread a few of the records on the table now, smoothing the pages carefully. The fire was warm on her left side. Outside, the village was waking fully. She could hear the smithy beginning to ring, the market carts rolling across the cobblestones, children's voices in the lane. She worked for 2 hours, organizing the documents in chronological order, noting which transfers corresponded to which entries in the contract she had found. By the time Marta brought her a second cup of tea without being asked, she had a clear, sequential record of 12 years of systematic theft. She sat back and looked at it. It was not nothing. It was, actually, considerable. She had not given herself credit for what she had been building, year by year, in those quiet account reviews, never knowing they were evidence. She had thought she was simply being careful. She had been, without knowing it, building a case. The morning passed. She did not allow herself to think about Harwick waking to find her gone, though the image pressed at the edge of her mind with uncomfortable persistence. She did not allow herself to think about what permanently resolved had meant in his letter to Corvin, though that pressed harder. She focused on the documents and on the fire, and on the specific manageable task in front of her. It was mid-afternoon when the sound of horses entered the village. Not one horse. Several. moving at a pace that was not quite urgency, but was significantly faster than casual travel. Ivy looked up from the table. Through the tavern's small window, she could see the lane outside, and what she saw made something cold pass through her chest. Harwick's colors. 2 riders in the gray and green livery of the Whitmore estate, or rather, of what Harwick had made of the Whitmore estate, pulling their horses to a stop in the center of the lane, and speaking to a woman at the well who was pointing, with the helpful innocence of someone who had no reason to be otherwise, toward the iron hearth. He had moved faster than she had calculated. The kitchen girl must have woken early after all. Ivy rose from the table, gathered the documents into the oilcloth bundle, and tied it closed with quick, practiced fingers. She pressed the bundle against her chest, scanned the room, fire, tables, the innkeeper's counter, a door at the back that almost certainly led to the kitchen, and made her decision in the space of a single breath. She was already moving toward the kitchen door when it opened from the outside. What entered was not Harwick's men. What entered was a man in black, with amber eyes and the kind of stillness that did not belong in a village tavern on a cold afternoon. He was alone, or appeared to be. She understood a moment later that there were others outside, positioned, quiet and efficient in the way of men who did not need to announce themselves to be present. He looked at her immediately, not searching, already knowing. Behind him, through the window, she could see Harwick's riders had gone very still in the lane, not because the man in black had spoken to them, simply because of what he was, because some authority does not require introduction. Ivy stood in the middle of the tavern with her bundle pressed to her chest, and her heart making a sound she could feel in her throat, and she looked at the Alpha King of Velmore, standing in a village tavern in a dusty travel cloak, looking at her with that same expression he had worn at the ball, patient, certain, slightly relieved. "I got your message," he said quietly. "From the posting rider." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "You came yourself?" "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a beat that felt longer than it was. Outside, one of his men said something low and authoritative to Harwick's riders, and the sound of horses moving away drifted through the window. "Because the inquiry is mine," Adrian said, "and because I should have moved sooner." He looked at the bundle in her arms. "Is that what I think it is?" 14 years of accounts, she said, "and your letter, which I only read last night." Something moved across his face then, not quite guilt, not quite grief, something between the two. He held the door open and stepped slightly to the side, giving her room, giving her the choice of direction. "Then we have a great deal to discuss," he said, "and you are considerably safer doing it somewhere that is not here." Ivy looked at him, at the open door, at the empty lane where Harwick's men had been. She thought about the account records, the deed, the contract, the letter she had carried against her ribs all night. She thought about exits, as she always did. Then she walked through the door he was holding, out into the cold afternoon, and did not look back at the tavern or the lane or the life she was leaving behind it. The king's horses were better than anything Ivy had ever ridden. She had not been on horseback in years. Harwick preferred the carriage, preferred her contained and still and visible only through glass. And the animal they gave her was a dark bay mare with a smooth, steady gait and the particular calm of a horse accustomed to difficult terrain and difficult situations. Ivy settled into the saddle and found, with some surprise, that her body remembered what to do. Her mother had taught her. One of the few things from before that had survived intact. Adrian rode beside her, not ahead. She noticed that. She noticed most things about him with an attention she could not entirely suppress, the way one notices a fire in a room that was cold a moment ago. Not with pleasure exactly, but with a kind of involuntary awareness. He had not explained himself further in the tavern. He had simply moved them out of Crestholm with efficient quiet, his men folding around them in a loose protective formation that was visible enough to deter and unobtrusive enough not to alarm. 3 riders ahead, 2 flanking, 1 at the rear. She counted them automatically. They were taking the north road, but not toward the capital. She realized this after the first hour, when the road should have curved east toward the lowland pass, and instead continued climbing into the ridge forest, the pines thickening on both sides, the air cooling and sharpening with resin. "This is not the road to Velmore," she said. "No." He did not elaborate immediately. She waited, and he continued. "There is a hunting lodge 2 hours further north. It belongs to the Crown. Secure, staffed, and not on any map that Harwick has access to." He glanced at her briefly. "I thought you would prefer somewhere to review those documents before we ride into the capital. You'll need to be prepared for what comes next." She considered that. What comes next? A formal council hearing, testimony, the presentation of your evidence against Harwick and Corvin. He paused. "It will not be comfortable. Council hearings rarely are, even in straightforward cases, and this one has complexity." "What complexity beyond what I already know?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. The light was shifting. Afternoon moving toward early evening, the pine canopy turning the light from gold to gray-green. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful in a way that told her he was choosing words with intention. "Corvin is not simply a merchant lord from the northern reaches," he said. "He is also the brother-in-law of Lord Prentice, who sits on the High Council. The fraudulent sale of your estate was partly designed to provide Corvin with the financial foundation to purchase a seat on the Trade Commission, a seat that would give his faction considerable influence over Eastern commerce, including the taxation of Crown territories." He let that settle. "Harwick was not simply stealing from you, Ivy. He was using you as a means to shift the balance of power within the council itself." She absorbed this in silence. The theft of her estate, her home, her parents' land, the only thing that had remained tethered to who she had been before loss had reorganized her life, had been, from another angle, a political maneuver. She had been useful in the way a coin is useful. Not seen. Simply spent. She had known the betrayal was large. She had not known it was that large. "You discovered this through the inquiry," she said. "Yes. 2 months ago. That is when I sent the letter." His jaw tightened very slightly. "I did not anticipate that your guardian would intercept royal correspondence. It is a serious offense. I should have sent a representative directly rather than relying on the post. You could not have known he would go that far. I should have assumed he would." He said it without self-pity, simply as a statement of error. I underestimated how much he had to lose. They rode in silence for a time. The forest was dense now, the road narrowing, the sound of the horses' hooves muffled by the pine carpet. Somewhere above them a hawk called once and went silent. "What was the letter to accomplish?" Ivy asked. "If I had received it in time?" "Warn you. Give you the opportunity to secure your own documentation before anyone could prevent it. And offer you the choice of appearing before the council voluntarily, with counsel, rather than being called as a witness without preparation." He paused. "The choice was always meant to be yours." She looked at him then, directly, for the first time since they had left Crestholm. He was watching the road, not her, which made looking at him easier. The travel cloak had settled around his shoulders in the specific way of clothing worn without self-consciousness. He rode the way he moved through the grand hall, without performance, without excess. She thought about choices, about how few she had been given, and how many she had quietly manufactured for herself, in the absence of being offered any. "I reviewed your letter last night," she said, "and this morning I organized 14 years of accounts into sequential evidence of fraud. I then walked 3 miles before dawn, convinced a crown messenger to carry my request to your council, and sat in a tavern waiting to be found by either your men or Harwick's." She paused. "I had already made the choice before you arrived." He turned to look at her then. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but something that acknowledged her as though recalibrating a previous estimate. "Yes," he said quietly. "You had." The lodge was smaller than she had expected for a royal property, which meant it was still considerably larger than anything she had known in the last decade. Stone walls, low and thick, built into the hillside as though grown from it. A courtyard with a well and 2 patient horses already stabled. Inside, fireplaces, good timber furniture, lamps that burned with clean oil, a long table that could serve for work or meals equally, and a room prepared with a narrow bed, clean linen, and a basin of water still faintly warm from the kitchen. She did not ask how the room had been prepared before their arrival. She was beginning to understand that the Alpha King of Velmore had a particular relationship with logistics, which was to say he managed them so thoroughly in advance that they became invisible. She washed her face and hands and changed into the clean dress that had been left folded on the chest. Gray wool, simple, well-made, the kind of thing that required no ornament and made no statement except basic dignity. She stood for a moment holding her own road-dirty dress and understood that someone had anticipated not only her arrival, but the specific condition she would be in when she arrived. That should have felt presumptuous. It felt, instead, like being seen. She joined him at the long table, where he had spread a set of documents from his own satchel alongside a lamp and a pot of tea that one of his 2 resident staff had produced without being asked. He did not look up immediately when she sat across from him, and she appreciated that too. The absence of ceremony. The assumption that she was capable of simply existing in a room without requiring acknowledgement. She unwrapped the oilcloth bundle and placed her records on the table. They worked for 3 hours. It was the strangest 3 hours of her life, and also, in some way she could not yet name, the most clarifying. He asked precise questions. She answered them. He cross-referenced her accounts against the inquiry documents he had brought. She identified discrepancies she had flagged years ago and explained the pattern she had observed. He noted things in a compact, economical hand. She noted things beside them. The tea went cold and was replaced. The fire in the hearth settled lower and was rebuilt by one of the staff. At no point did he explain something she had already understood. At no point did he suggest she might be mistaken about her own records. He simply worked alongside her, with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to complex problems, and comfortable with the presence of someone equally focused across the table. Around the 3rd hour, she caught herself thinking that this was what it might have been like if her father had lived, sitting at a table with someone who did not require her to be small in order for him to feel large. She caught the thought and set it aside. Corvin is in the capital currently, Adrian said, setting down a document. He arrived 4 days ago, which I believe was premature. He expected the final transfer to be completed before anyone had cause to question it. When it does not come through on schedule, he will begin to worry. And Harwick will tell him I've gone, Ivy said. Yes. Which gives us perhaps 2 days before they attempt to accelerate their plan or obscure the evidence. He looked at her steadily. We need to move the hearing forward. I would normally allow more preparation time, but I think the timing is more important than comfort. I don't need comfort, she said. I need it to be over. He held her gaze for a moment. Then we go to the capital tomorrow. She nodded. Then, because the question had been sitting in her chest since the ball, and she was tired of carrying things she could simply set down. Why did you come yourself? To the tavern. You could have sent your men. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the documents on the table, then at her, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its formal precision. Not entirely, but enough. Because I wrote that letter, he said, and it did not reach you. And whatever happened to you in the time between when I sent it and when you found it, that is partly my responsibility. He paused. I did not want to send men. I wanted to come. Ivy looked at him for a long moment. She was not naive. She had spent 14 years in the company of a man who had used warmth as a tool, and she knew the performance of sincerity well enough to distrust it reflexively. But there was something in the Alpha King's manner that was not performing anything. He was not trying to make her feel something. He was simply telling her what was true, in the way of someone who had decided some time ago that simplicity was more respectful than strategy. She did not trust it fully. She was not ready to trust it fully. But she noted it. Then we go tomorrow, she said, and began reordering her documents for the morning. He returned to his own papers. The fire crackled. Outside, the forest was dark and still and smelled of pine and cold and something clean that had no name except relief. She allowed herself to notice that she had eaten a full supper without her throat closing around it for the first time in 3 weeks. She allowed herself to notice that the cold that had been sitting in her sternum since she had read that letter on Harwick's desk was, for the moment, not quite as heavy. She did not call it safety. Not yet. But she noted that too. The capital of Velmore was nothing like Ivy remembered. She had been there once, at 13. In Harwick's carriage with the curtains drawn, because he had said the crowds were overwhelming for a child of delicate constitution. She had pressed her face against the gap in the velvet and seen fragments. A fountain, a market stall draped in red cloth, a guard in silver armor, a woman laughing. It had felt enormous and impossible, and completely out of reach. She rode into it now on the dark bay mare, beside the Alpha King, with the oilcloth bundle secured to her saddle and her back straight, and her eyes open. It was enormous. It was not impossible. The castle of Velmore rose at the city's center like something that had grown rather than been built. Gray stone and high towers and banners of deep blue snapping in the morning wind. The streets leading to it were wide and cobbled, lined with merchants and craftsmen and the specific organized chaos of a city that had been functioning for centuries and had no intention of stopping. Smiths, bakers, cloth merchants, herb sellers with bundles hanging from their stall beams. The smell was complex. Bread and smoke and horse and somewhere beneath it all, rain on stone. The particular cold mineral smell of a city that had been rained on 1,000 times and absorbed it all. No one stopped to stare at the king as he rode through. That surprised her, until she realized it should not have. He moved through the city the way the city moved around him, as though both were simply doing what they had always done, without requiring comment. The castle staff received them with efficient quiet. Ivy was given rooms in the guest wing, not the ward's quarters, not a servant's room, not a space that communicated her position as something uncertain and temporary, but actual rooms, with a sitting area and a proper hearth, and a window that looked out over a garden where something was still, improbably, blooming in the late autumn cold. A woman named Sarah, who introduced herself as the head lady of the household in a tone that suggested she managed considerably more than that, appeared within the hour, with a council-appropriate dress. Deep burgundy wool with clean lines and no excessive ornamentation. And the information that the hearing had been called for the following morning. "Is there anything you require tonight?" Sarah asked. Ivy thought about it honestly. A quill, fresh ink, and 2 hours of quiet. Sarah provided all three without comment, which Ivy found deeply restoring. She spent the evening writing. Not the account records. Those were organized and ready. What she wrote instead was a clear, sequential account of her own experience. Every document she had signed without understanding. Every conversation she could remember with Harwick that now read differently in retrospect. Every small manipulation that had seemed like guardianship and had been something else entirely. She wrote it in the same precise hand she used for accounts, without embellishment, without excessive emotion. Simply the facts arranged in the order they had occurred. When she finished, past midnight, she read it back once. Then she set it with the other documents, and went to bed and slept, for the first time in weeks, without waking. The council chamber was large and formal, and smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the particular tension of a room where significant things had been decided for a very long time. Ivy walked into it the next morning, and did not allow herself to hesitate at the threshold. There were 11 council members at the long curved table. She recognized Lord Prentice immediately, a heavy-set man with careful eyes who had the particular stillness of someone aware that his own interests were about to be examined. Beside him, 2 seats down, sat a man she had never seen, but whose face matched the description Commander Aldrich had given her that morning in a brief preparatory meeting. Corvin, merchant lord, Northern Reaches, her land, partially sold, her future, partially spent. He was younger than she had imagined. That surprised her. He looked at her with an expression she recognized. The measuring look of a man reassessing whether something he had dismissed as simple is in fact complicated. She sat in the witness chair and placed her documents on the table in front of her, and looked at him steadily until he looked away. Adrian sat at the head of the table. He had not spoken to her this morning beyond a brief, quiet exchange in the corridor outside where he had asked if she was ready, and she had said yes. He had not offered reassurance. She had not needed it. What he had done, which she recognized only now as she sat in that chair and felt the weight of 11 sets of eyes, was position himself at an angle where she could see him clearly from the witness chair, not watching over her, simply present. Commander Aldrich opened the proceedings. The charges were read in the formal language of Crown law: fraudulent management of a ward's estate, unauthorized transfer of noble property, obstruction of royal correspondence, conspiracy to defraud the Crown through the manipulation of Trade Commission appointment. The language was precise and cold, and each charge landed in the room with the weight of something that could not be undone by good intentions. Harwick was not present. He had been collected from his estate that morning by Crown guards. She learned this from Aldrich, delivered without drama, as a logistical fact. He was in the castle's lower holding rooms, which were not a dungeon precisely, but were not comfortable either. She thought about that, and felt something complex that she chose not to examine in detail. She was called to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not rush. She presented each document in order, explained its significance, and answered the council's questions with the same directness she had used at the posting station in Crestholm. Only what was factual, only what could be supported. She referenced specific entries in the accounts. She read the relevant sections of the Corvin contract. She presented the king's letter and explained precisely where it had been found, and in what condition. When she described reading the deed and finding her own name absent from it, the chamber was very quiet. Lord Prentice attempted, twice, to redirect the questioning toward procedural concerns: the validity of documents retrieved without authorization, the ambiguity of the guardianship terms. Adrian shut both attempts down with a brevity that was more authoritative than any lengthy argument could have been. He simply said, the first time, "The documents are valid. Continue." And the second time, without looking at Prentice, "The question is not relevant to the current testimony. You will have opportunity to speak when she has finished." Prentice did not attempt a third time. Corvin was questioned separately, after Ivy had concluded. She did not stay to watch that. Aldrich escorted her to a smaller adjoining room with a fire and a window and a chair, and she sat and looked at the garden below, and breathed slowly, and waited. It took 2 hours. When Aldrich returned, his expression told her before his words did. "The council has ruled," he said. "Lord Harwick has been stripped of his guardianship and title, pending criminal prosecution. The transfers to Corvin are declared void and subject to reversal under Crown authority. Whitmore Estate is restored to your name, in full, effective immediately." He paused. "Lord Prentice has been removed from the council pending investigation of his connection to Corvin's commission appointment." Ivy sat with that for a moment. Outside, the garden. The improbable late autumn bloom, something small and white she couldn't name from this distance, holding on past the season it was supposed to belong to. "And Corvin?" she asked. "Detained. The Northern Merchant Guilds will be notified. His trade licenses are suspended pending the outcome of the criminal inquiry." She nodded slowly. She had expected to feel something explosive at this moment. Triumph, perhaps, or the release of something long compressed. What she felt instead was quieter than that. Not disappointment. More like the specific silence after a long sound finally stops. The absence of the tension she had been carrying so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Whitmore was hers, her parents' land, the timber and the mill and the farmland in the valley below the ridge. 4 generations of her family returned to her in the formal language of council law on a cold autumn morning. She thought of her mother, the lavender, the hand on her hair. She allowed herself that for a moment privately, before she stood. Adrian was in the corridor when she came out of the adjoining room. He was alone, or as alone as he ever was, which meant his men were present, but at a respectful distance. He looked at her with the same expression she had been trying to categorize since the ball, the one that was neither inventory nor performance. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. At the corridor, stone-walled, lit by torches in iron brackets, smelling of old wood and cold and the faint cedar of his coat. She thought about the letter he had written, the inquiry he had opened without her knowledge, on her behalf, simply because the numbers in a council record had been wrong, and he had decided that mattered. "You began this investigation 2 months ago," she said, "before I knew anything was wrong, before I had any reason to contact you. The council records showed irregularities. It was my responsibility to act on them. You could have sent a clerk. I sent a letter. You came to a village tavern yourself." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Why does it matter to you? Specifically, not as a king, as a person." The question landed in the corridor and stayed there. He did not deflect it. He considered it with the seriousness she had come to expect from him, the absence of performance that still, even now, surprised her. "Because what was done to you was not incidental," he said. "You were not a casualty of someone else's ambition. You were the target of it, deliberately, systematically over years. And you were left without the information you needed to defend yourself." He paused. "That is not something I can observe and simply file in a record." Ivy looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the account books she had kept for 14 years, meticulous and precise, never knowing she was building evidence. She thought about the letter she had pressed against her ribs in the dark, about the mare's steady gait on the northern road, about the dress laid out in the lodge, and the tea that was replaced without being asked for, and the position he had taken in the council chamber so she could see him without having to search. She thought about the difference between being managed and being seen. "I want to go home," she said, "to Whitmore. I want to see it properly for the first time in years, as something that actually belongs to me." "Then you will," he said simply. "I don't know what condition it's in. Harwick may have allowed the farmland to decline if he was planning to sell it anyway. My steward can arrange an assessment. Workers, if needed. Resources." He said it without making it a gift, simply a logical next step, which she appreciated more than any grand gesture would have been. She looked at him once more. Then she said quietly, the thing she had been holding at careful distance for days. "The inquiry brought you to my estate records. But you came to that ball, and you found me in that crowd, and you asked about the letter yourself." She paused. "That wasn't administrative." He met her eyes without looking away. "No," he said. "It was not." The torch between them crackled softly. Somewhere in the castle, a door opened and closed. The world continued doing what it had always done. "I'm not ready," she said. It was important to say it honestly. "For whatever that means, I'm not ready. Too much has happened too quickly, and I've been trusting the wrong people for too long to simply—" She stopped. "I'm not ready." "I know," he said. And then, without pressure, without the particular weight of a man who expects a different answer, "Go home, Ivy. See your land. Let things be still for a while." He paused. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned toward the end of the corridor where the light was coming in from outside, clear and cold, and the particular silver white of late autumn sun. She reached Whitmore 3 days later. The farmhouse needed work. The roof on the eastern barn had softened over a winter of neglect, and 2 of the fence lines had collapsed into the long grass. But the house itself was sound. Stone walls, deep-set windows, a hearth large enough to stand in. The orchard behind the house still had 3 trees that had not yet shed their last leaves, orange and gold against the gray sky, holding on past everything. She stood in the doorway of the house her parents had built, and breathed in the cold air that smelled of earth and rain and old timber, and the faint ghost of lavender that she was almost certain was real and not invented by grief. It was hers. The work that followed was not easy and was not fast. The steward Adrian sent was a practical, unassuming man named Hewitt, who assessed the damage without exaggeration and organized the necessary repairs with quiet competence. Local workers came, fences were rebuilt, the barn roof was relaid before the first serious snow. The farmland, which had been underworked but not destroyed, was assessed for the spring planting. Ivy worked alongside them, not because she had to, because the work was hers and she had been absent from it for too long. She slept well for the first time in years. She ate without her throat closing. She woke in the mornings and looked out at the orchard and the valley below, and felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. Ordinary, quiet, continuous peace. Letters came from the capital. Legal correspondence mostly. The formal documentation of the estate's restoration. The progression of the criminal proceedings against Harwick and Corvin. Harwick was stripped of all titles and holdings, sentenced by the Crown Court to 7 years in the Northern Territories under supervised exile, his assets liquidated to partially compensate for the fraud. Corvin's trade licenses were permanently revoked. He was fined heavily and barred from any future council involvement. Lord Prentice resigned from the council formally and retreated to his country estate, which was considered, in the language of court, sufficient consequence for a man whose crime was proximity rather than direct action. Among the legal correspondence, every week or so, there was another letter. Different handwriting from the council documents. Precise and economical, the hand of someone accustomed to writing orders. But in these letters, different. Not orders, not administrative. Questions about the farm, observations about the season, something that had happened in the capital that week that he thought she might find interesting or absurd. Nothing that demanded a response. Everything that invited one. She responded. Slowly at first. Then more readily. By midwinter she had told him about her mother's lavender, about the 3 trees in the orchard, about the first morning after the roof was finished, when she had stood in the eastern barn in the clean silence of a space that was no longer broken and had cried for about 5 minutes for reasons she could not entirely articulate, and had then felt completely fine. He wrote back that he understood that specific feeling better than she might expect. She believed him. He came to Whitmore in early spring. She had known he was coming. He had written. But knowing and seeing were different things. And she stood in the farmhouse doorway watching him ride down the valley road with 2 men at a respectful distance, and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unsteady for a very long time. He dismounted at the gate. He looked at the house, at the orchard, at the repaired fence lines, and the plowed field ready for planting. Then he looked at her. "It suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed. They walked the property together in the late morning light, the ground still soft from the last thaw, the orchard just beginning to show the first pale suggestion of blossom. She showed him the eastern barn with its new roof, the mill at the bottom of the south field, the old boundary stone at the edge of the timber that her father had carved her name into when she was small, the letters worn, but still legible. Ivy. Whitmore. Always. She had not remembered it until she had found it again in the autumn, clearing the overgrowth from the fence line. She had stood with her hand on the carved stone for a long time. He stood beside her now and looked at it, and did not say anything, which was exactly right. They sat at the kitchen table after, with bread and hard cheese and the last of the autumn apple preserve that Ivy had made herself in November from the 3 trees in the orchard. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the valley was coming back to life in the small, determined way of things that have survived a difficult season. "I am ready," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was simply the next true thing, stated in the same direct manner she had learned to use when she stopped making herself small. Not because everything is resolved, not because I'm not still cautious, but because I know the difference now between someone who manages me and someone who sees me. She paused. "You see me." He looked at her across the table, the amber eyes, steady and warm in the kitchen light. "I do," he said. "I don't need the king," she said. "I need the man who came to a village tavern himself. They are the same person, he said. "But I understand what you mean." She did too. They were married in late spring, in the orchard at Whitmore when the 3 trees were in full bloom, white petals drifting in the mild wind, like something the season was deliberately providing. No grand ceremony, no court spectacle, a crown officiant, 2 witnesses, and the specific, irreversible weight of words spoken in the open air above the valley that had belonged to her family for 4 generations. Adrian placed the ring on her finger with the same steadiness he brought to everything. Unhurried, certain, present. She looked at him and thought about the ball, the candles too bright, the green dress, the crowd parting. The question he had asked her in the middle of all that noise. The letter she had never received. The drawer she had opened in the dark. The road she had walked before dawn with her bundle pressed against her chest, and no certainty except the necessity of moving. All of it had led here, to this orchard, to this man, to her own name, carved in the boundary stone at the field's edge, worn but legible. Ivy, Whitmore, always. She was still Ivy Whitmore. She was also now something more. Not less herself. More. That was what she had not expected. That love, when it was the right kind, did not require reduction. The petals drifted. The valley stretched below them, green and alive and entirely hers. His hand was warm in hers. Harwick was gone. Corvin was gone. The life built on her smallness and ignorance was gone. The cold in her sternum, the counted exits, the careful silences, those were going too, slowly, the way winter goes, not all at once, but genuinely and without return. What remained was simpler than anything she had been given, and more solid than everything she had been promised. Land. Truth. A man who had written her a letter and then come himself. And the particular, irreplaceable peace of knowing exactly where she stood,